Oh, well, hello there. Welcome back to the final edition uh, of Intracultural Anthropology. We're going to be jumping into this big exercise on picking a subject, in this case, the COVID-19 pandemic. Yay! More pandemic talk. But here's the thing, we're going to take the holistic approach. We're going to look at everything we possibly can dealing with the pandemic, and then discussing how it all sort of fits together. Why do people do the things that they do when it comes to the pandemic, and what's motivating people to behave the way that they are? So we're going to take kind of a real quick, brief look at all these different subjects, and kind of discuss how it is all impactful. Let's see. So we're going to be putting all this stuff together. And I think the important thing that we have to understand is that this pandemic is going to affect everyone either directly or indirectly. Certainly in the United States, everyone has been affected fairly directly in one form or a fashion. It's impacted everyone. There are other places around the world where they might not have been impacted as much, but later on it might have an impact on them indirectly. So it basically affects everyone, right, in some form or fashion. So one of the first things that we have to do when we're talking about studying a subject like this is we want to look at the past, right? What's happened before? How do we know how pandemics behave, right? So we're gonna be looking at different things. So some questions to ask: what are some pandemic events to have taken place in our recent and distant past? We can look to events like the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu believed to have killed probably around 50 million people. There's kind of a wide range, and we don't really know exactly how many because it was so bad and lasted for years that records weren't kept very well. But there were a lot of things that we did learn about how it was spread. We figured out that it was spread through the air. So we see a lot of mask mandates coming about in the Spanish flu. And we actually see, certainly in American culture, again, some pushback against those mask mandates, which I find pretty interesting. We can also look at like the Black Plague, right? The bubonic plague. If we look at what happened in Europe, right? About 1 in 3 people died from the bubonic plague. That was 20 million people. Worldwide, estimates are pretty wild, between like 75 million and 200 million people died from the bubonic plague. Now, of course, that was late 14th century, where we didn't have a lot of the medical science, technology, understanding that we do now. So how did people deal with it then, right? What were their struggles? And obviously, they were heavy duty when you look at like Europe and you lose a third of your population. So those are some historical context for us to look at. And how does that compare today to the spread of the virus, and how do we of COVID-19, and how are we dealing with the virus itself? So yeah, and the other question is, were these diseases cured, or were they suffered? And that's an interesting question, because sometimes diseases, they just run out of people to kill, because there might be people that are a little bit more naturally immune. And that's kind of how they're thinking about the bubonic plague, is that there was a genetic bottleneck taking place, and that the people that survived the plague were no longer, going to be like majorly affected by it later on. And so people basically suffered and survived. Spanish flu, we had a little bit more technology, a little bit better understanding of disease, and how it can pass from person to person. So those deaths could be mitigated. We could have a better understanding, better practices on how to deal with that. And of course, with COVID-19, we have a lot of information about it, not only about how it's transmitted and how variants are changing, but how to beat it, especially with doing best practices like wearing a face mask and social distancing and stuff like that to keep the spread down. So, and then of course the vaccine as well. And that's kind of a big thing. We've eliminated quite a few diseases by using various vaccines. Figuring out how this disease is spread, and then being able to tackle it so that you might not get it. If you've ever done any extensive traveling, you know all about getting vaccines to be able to go to certain countries. I know when I went to Kenya, man, I got a lot of shots in my arm, but there's a lot of diseases that we're not used to. And so we take the precaution of getting those vaccines. So, we've got this historical context to look at. How did different populations do around the world, right? Were they more effective or less effective? How was the infrastructure set in place to be able to deal with those issues? Hospitals, religions, all of this stuff, were they set up, right? Did they have the material needed? We can compare that to what's going on today. How is culture going to react to a pandemic? And this is really important to understand because different cultures are going to react differently. And certainly within, if we look at the United States, we have dealt with it in some pretty dramatically different ways, depending on the information that we're given. Because the United States is so diverse, not only in its people, but in thought, in religious ideology, in political ideology, all of these things are going to be sort of at conflict with each other because we're so diverse, because we allow that diversity. In this case, we're having some very, very drastically different results, right? So how are we dealing with this, and what's going to be the ultimate outcome, right? What's going to happen with these various aspects of our culture, especially when we're talking about like vaccines? They're saying that somewhere in the range of like 40% of Republicans are going to refuse to get the vaccine. And a lot of those folks have, and I think this is the really important thing to remember as an anthropologist, is that they feel that they are very justified in their reasons for not getting the vaccine. Now, whether or not scientifically, it's correct, right? Their fears should not necessarily be swept aside, right? They have legitimate reasons for their safety and that kind of stuff to have those kinds of ideas. Even if, as a scientist, and I'm saying this as a scientist, those fears are not necessarily justified, we don't, as an anthropologist, we're not going to be placing blame on one group of people or another, right? It comes down to the fact that we have to try and understand the why. You know, what's happening here? Why are people believing a certain way? Why are they acting a certain way? And then how do we understand that? And how do we empathize with them? And that's, I think, just in general, a lot of our issues come from the inability to communicate in civil discourse, especially when it comes to subjects like this. So when you are having that discussion with somebody about the pandemic, you know, instead of, you know, getting upset or angry or defensive about your ideas, try and take the middle road. Try and figure out why they think the way that they do. Try and figure out why you think the way that you do. You know, if it's one way or the other. You know, and then see if you can't have that civil discourse, you know, and have that discussion about what's happening and why. Let's see. Understanding how this is going to have an impact on our culture, both in so many different ways, right? And in culture, I mean, we're talking all-encompassing here. This is kind of, you know, all the different aspects of what we have talked about throughout this semester. We're going to see changes in how we approach just about everything, right? How we approach work, how we approach education, relationships, kinship, our families, international relations. All of these different things have been impacted by COVID-19. So we have to ask these questions. How is this going to impact our culture, and how is it going to impact other cultures and our relationship with them? Doing field work, you know, figuring out the answers to these questions, right? You know, for us, we have to go out and actually study and, you know, find why. Why is this happening? What's going on here? But that's also changed, right? Doing traditional field work isn't possible right now because, you know, with social distancing and not having physical access to other people, we find ourselves living in a slightly different arena when it comes to trying to find out information about folks and about the questions that we have. So what happens? You know, our traditional techniques have been severely diminished. So how do we create new ones, right? You know, technology is there. We can do interviews via Zoom or Teams or, you know, whatever. But that also has its limitations. Just not being in contact, being able to read body language, can have an impact on what people are saying. At the same time, it eliminates distance, right? You don't have to travel all over the place. You can do it from your home, right? But another issue is who's got access to that technology, right? Not everybody does. So are we going to have problems with access to that kind of technology that we can use to interact with people, where being in someone's physical presence eliminates that? So what are the limitations of technology and what are the benefits? And then dealing with isolation, you know, isolation in general. How does that have an impact on individuals? Not only their mental state, but their physical state as well. And then how is that going to impact our information gathering, and also our ability to interview as well, by having our own issues that we're dealing with as researchers. So all of these things can impact how we actually go out and gather information. language. If we're talking about language and how people use language in this pandemic, right? Who uses it for what, right? If we pay attention to what happened during the Trump administration and the language that was coming out of the White House, and on the conservative side of politics, we see a very slow reaction to the pandemic, not really going with the science that goes with it. On the other hand, we also see the other side that in some cases might have overreacted to the precautions or to what was going on. But language can have that huge impact. The different words are going to be used. If we look at sort of the issues with the president of the United States calling the COVID-19 like the China virus or the Kung flu, making light of a situation, also using degrading terminology, can kind of lead us down a very interesting and I would say dark path when it comes to the power of language, right? And people dismissing the importance of things. So how language is used, the power that it has, how does it use to create that positive or negative impact, and who's creating that language, right? We see a lot of folks talking about, especially on late night news or CNN or Fox, these big news companies that are using their platform to give information, and oftentimes opposing amounts of information. Now, one thing is this, one thing is that. Where do you find the actual information? So that's a big issue, right? Who's spreading that information around, and how do you trust them? How do you trust that as a source? And so a lot of that comes down to power and control, right? Who's talking to who? Who's got the largest megaphone? And we saw sort of the reactions to all of that. Not only what happened to a number of folks when it comes to, say, like Trump and having his Twitter account canceled, which is not only due to pandemic but also to the political atmosphere, which certainly was connected to the pandemic. So those two things are definitely interconnected. So how do they play out, right? So those are some questions that we would want to ask. Kinship, right? How do families deal with the pandemic? And this is a really important way of looking at what's been going on. How are families going to be dealing with this? What kind of structure do they have set up for support, right? Because we are oftentimes this nuclear family setup where a lot of times our families are spread all over the country, right? Your parents might live in a different state, your siblings might live in a different state, and you're left to sort of deal with your own issues and what happens if you get sick. What kind of resources do you have to draw upon? And how is that going to compare with other families that are more complex when it comes to who's living with whom? So if you have a larger family that live together, how are they going to be able to support each other? At the same time, as the disease spreads, having that social isolation is also beneficial. Because if you live at home with your brothers and sisters and parents and grandparents and kids and all of that stuff, the likelihood of getting infected goes up. And then what happens to the people that do get sick? Especially when you're dealing with folks that might be more susceptible. So, we look at different impacts from different ways. You might have bigger families that can support each other, especially economically, but might be at more risk to having from being infected. So yeah, those are some questions. What happens about long-term separation when you say you do live in the same town as your parents, but you can't see them, right? What happens to your grandparents if they're living in a assisted living situation and their health deteriorates, but you can't see them because of restrictions, right? Because it's not safe to. What happens to kids when they can't see their family or their friends? What happens when they can't go to school to be together with the people that they care about? What happens to those relationship building skills that kids need to develop, which is why kids going to schools are so important, having those social networks. All of those things can be impacted. What happens to like marriages and divorces, right? How many people are going to put off getting married? How many people are going to be pushed to get divorces? What about kids? In times past, we see when two people are forced to be together for a long time, especially during like blizzards or other like events that kind of force us all to get together, we usually see a little bit of a baby boom. But there's speculation right now that might not actually be the case this time. That because of social distancing, because of economic pressure, that we might actually see a drop in kids being born, which I think is a really interesting, outcome to all of this. So, and parents are oftentimes, because their kids can't go to school, are forced to deal with their kids on a regular basis. And how is that impacting family life and what's happening there? And as a lot of parents are forced to work from home, how is that impacting their life? How is that impacting their kids? In some ways good, in other ways bad. So, what kinds of things can we try and understand about family dynamics as they've had to shift? And then in the future, are they going to shift back, right? Is there going to be a new normal, or are we going to try and get back to the way things were? So, some interesting questions about how are things going to shift. So, and I think education is also going to be an important thing to look at here. How are we going to be dealing with kids going to school and colleges and college students? You guys, how are you guys dealing with it? And how is it affecting your family life? Religion. How do religions deal with this pandemic? What's going on there? I think there are some interesting questions that we can kind of ask here. So, what have been the various responses? Some folks, especially very conservative folks, are going to have a different reaction and belief in possibly divine intervention to save them, right? So there might not be much of a reaction to it. or there might be different reasons for causation, right? A lot of folks that are going to see this might not think of it as necessarily a disease, but maybe a punishment, right? Um, how are folks going to view this and different aspects of religion? One of the things that we do know a lot about religion and a lot of religious communities is that in times of trouble they come together, right? And they find comfort and support dealing with these issues together. So how does that impact a community? If you've got a very tight-knit religious community, and somebody is sick or somebody is having troubles economically, those communities can come together and support each other. And that's one of the really important aspects about understanding religious groups. It's not only their response to the disease or the causation, but it's their response to their community. So while in some cases it might be at opposing ideologies within the scientific community, the actual response by the community to support its members can be pretty indicative of the community and how much it cares about each other. So let's see. Yeah, that's about that. Race and racism. This is kind of a big subject here. When we look at what has happened this past year with George Floyd, and how we've seen these various things take place that are exacerbated by the pandemic, and I sometimes question would George Floyd's death been as impactful had it not been during COVID, and by that I say that with societal stress already being pushed to breaking limits, we see this absolutely horrible event take place. And the response was beyond comparison to anything I've ever seen. And I think the only real historical context would be the riots in the 1960s for social justice, right? I think that's the only comparison that I can think of that directly relates. And of course, dealing with the same issue, right? Dealing with social injustice, dealing with policing, dealing with how communities are impacted by institutional racism, and individual racism as well. So all of these things are having an impact, right? So we see the reaction to all of this stuff going on. Besides George Floyd and besides the social justice movement that has really arisen since then, how is it affecting race and racism in general? And there's a lot of interesting things going on. If we look at a lot of African American communities, one of the things that we have seen is that it's impacting them at a much larger rate and having a higher impact. And the question is why? Well, there's quite a few reasons why, and we can, it has to go to economic status, inequality as far as having jobs, access to health care, that kind of stuff. There's also this historical context that when dealing with the medical field. Within African American societies, a lot of times doctors would not give the best, they would not do their best practices. They would discriminate. They would, there's always this sort of, inequity when it came to healthcare. And it's still there today. There's still this compounding impact that has taken place that was going on before the pandemic. But now we're seeing it even come to more of an effect that these communities are having lots of issues. What about Asian American communities? We're seeing a lot of racism against them. If you, I've heard plenty of stories on the news about Asian Americans, being chased or being assaulted or harassed. Talking about the disease came from China, and why don't you go back to China? And it's like I'm Japanese American. That's not where I'm from, but that doesn't matter because you're being judged based upon your physical attributes. So we're seeing an uptick in that, and it's the same sort of uptick that we saw after like 9/11, right? After 9/11, if you looked like you were from the Middle East, then you might get assaulted. And there are plenty of examples of people that were, from Puerto Rico or Mexico that, might have looked Arab in some way, and they got harassed just because of their skin color, or just because of, they wore a different style of clothing, right? So we see how racism has been impacting the folks because of this disease, right? Because of the idea, well, it came from China, so we have to get our aggression out by attacking Chinese people, which is ridiculous and aggravating beyond belief. And then also talking about like communities that aren't talked about a lot, especially like Native American communities, where again, running into the same sort of issues of oftentimes extremely poor health care that is being provided. So just the availability of getting the vaccine or getting access to preventative health or access to ventilators and all that kind of thing. Native American communities have been disproportionately hit hard because of it. And a lot of it comes down to, again, resources and how those resources are spread around. And also historical context of doctors and medicine and not treating Native Americans in an equal and just way. So we see those inequalities as well, dealing with race. And then we see stuff like, Black Lives Matters, and we see the opposing side, like the alt left, right? And the alt left, the white nationalists and the neo Nazis and Proud Boys and all of those pretty vile groups, right? That are dealing with again this racist interpretation, right? And this is where I struggle as an anthropologist, keeping my own personal thoughts and emotions when dealing with racist ideology. It can be difficult to understand why these folks believe the things that they do? Why do they take on oftentimes very, very hateful and very dangerous ideologies that can really impact people's lives? So that kind of thing can be really really difficult to kind of dive into if you're trying to find out stuff about like the alt-right. Then you have Black Lives Matters, which came again. It's a grassroots organization, and people got pissed off. And this is where we see again social change. I have a tendency to lean much more in support of the BLM movement. I don't agree with rioting. That's I don't think we should do that. But we need to protest. That's the whole point of the First Amendment, is to be able to gather and speak. I might be giving you more opinion than actual science here, but when it comes to this kind of stuff, again, recognizing personal bias is a continual process. Right? We have to think about what's going on and try to understand our own perspectives. And you're going to find a lot of anthropologists that are going to kind of feel the same way because we are trying to understand people, and we believe that people should be treated equally and not differently because of their race or their gender or their sexuality or any of those things. So, this can be one of those social action, social anthropology, applied anthropology projects that a lot of us end up getting into. And so dealing with these issues, right? And dealing with how different races are dealing with the pandemic, right? And a lot of that all comes down to resources. Ethnicity and nationalism. So how do different cultures, how do different nations deal with the pandemic and what's going on? What can we learn from different countries as they have approached the pandemic? As we've gone through this, I look at places like New Zealand, right? New Zealand clamped down hard as soon as COVID got there. They clamped down hard and they knocked it out pretty well. And they're pretty much back to normal. And anytime it pops up, they clamp down hard again. And they've cut down on the transmission of disease. Right? But there's other things that are impacting that as well. New Zealand's not a big country. They're also physically isolated, right? Because they're a bloody island. So there's those things that we have to take into consideration as well. And we can take a look at their leadership structure and how they responded to the scientific information. We can take a look at their religious impact as well. And New Zealand is, as far as religion goes, they don't follow a lot. Right? I think it's somewhere in the range of about 40% of New Zealanders actually have or consider themselves to be a part of a religion, which is kind of an astonishing number, especially within Western civilization. But both Australia and New Zealand have very similar reactions to religion. So how are they dealing with it versus how the United States are dealing with it, or how is Europe dealing with it? We look at, like, say, Sweden. Sweden, they just said, we're going for herd immunity. We're not really going to do social distancing. We're not going to do mask mandates or anything like that. And they got whipped hard, right? They had a ton of cases until they had to, all of a sudden go like, maybe we should clamp down and maybe we should lock everybody in a place and do that social distancing. They were trying a different tactic that didn't work out well. where you've got other countries that have had, varying impacts. You look at like Germany or Great Britain, where they clamp down and start to see things kind of slow down. They're like, okay, so things are slowing down. We're gonna open it up again, and then all of a sudden it gets worse, and then clamp down, and then open up, and then clamp down, and open up, and kind of like the United States, right? We've done that a number of times here. Start making headway, and then we're doing pretty good. That's loosen up again, and then all of a sudden it gets worse, and then we go through another wave, and so on and so forth. And then it impacts different areas in different amounts of time. Comparing like North Dakota to New York, right? North and South Dakota, really didn't get impacted by the pandemic at all during the first few months, if not like the first 6 months. But it's interesting to note that the entire population of I think South Dakota could fit into Denver. In fact, less than Denver, right? They're small states, not a lot of population, not a lot of traveling, and so they weren't affected immediately. But when they did get hit hard, they got hit really hard, and I think currently are at the top of the transmission rate in the nation, and it's because of delayed reaction, right? They saw what was going on; it wasn't impacting them, so they didn't put in any precautions and thought that they could get around it. Didn't work that way. So, how do different states, in this case, other countries, how do they deal with the pandemic? What are their responses? And that's the interesting thing. Even with the United States, we had a very weak federal response dealing with the pandemic early on. But different states took different approaches. Some states locked down real hard, real quick, and did their best to mitigate the damage. Other states stayed open and kept having surges in the disease. And then what happened after Biden was elected? When Biden became president, he had this big push to get vaccines in the arms. And has done a pretty phenomenal job of getting that distribution going. So, how are different countries and different political leaders and different states dealing with the pandemic? Okay, we're going to stop there. This is going to be part one of this discussion. Take a few minutes, get a breather in. Get something to drink, and we'll come back in a few and finish this out. Okay, see you in a minute.